The church bell tolled mournfully as thunder cracked across the darkening Montana sky, promising a storm that would match the turmoil in Thomas James's soul. The year was 1876, and like many men who survived the Civil War, Thomas had been running from ghosts for over a decade. Tonight, those ghosts would finally catch up to him, just not in the way he expected. Thomas pulled his duster tighter as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Sweetwater was a small town, barely a speck on the Montana Territory map, but it had a church, a saloon, and enough distance from his past to let him breathe. He'd been drifting for so long that the concept of staying put seemed foreign, yet something about this town had made him linger longer than usual. He'd just finished his evening patrol, not that Sweetwater needed much policing, but Sheriff Daniels had appreciated the extra help, and the pay was enough for room and board. Thomas was heading back to his modest lodgings when he saw her. There, huddled against the weathered church doors, was a woman. Her dark hair hung in damp tendrils around her face, and her simple dress was soaked through. But what caught Thomas's attention was the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath her shawl. She was with child, and from the looks of it, not far from her time. Thomas approached cautiously, not wanting to frighten her. "Miss, are you all right?" The woman's head snapped up, revealing a face that, despite its exhaustion and fear, held a quiet dignity. Her eyes, the color of summer cornflowers, widened at the sight of his badge. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the increasing rainfall. "I have nowhere else to go." Thomas knelt before her, keeping a respectful distance. He could see now that she was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and there was a fading bruise along her jawline that made his blood simmer. "I'm Deputy Thomas James," he said gently. "What's your name, madam?" She hesitated, one hand protectively covering her belly. "Olivia," she finally answered. "Olivia Jenkins." A particularly loud crack of thunder made her flinch, and Thomas made a decision. He removed his hat, letting the rain dampen his sandy brown hair. "Mrs. Jenkins, you're not alone anymore," he said with quiet certainty. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry." For a moment she didn't move, searching his face for any sign of deceit. Thomas remained still, letting her make the choice. Finally she extended a trembling hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. "It's Miss," she corrected softly, "and I have nothing to offer in return for your kindness." Thomas shook his head as he gently supported her weight. "Nothing is expected, Miss Jenkins, nothing at all." As they walked slowly through the deepening mud toward Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, Thomas couldn't know that this rain-soaked encounter on the church steps would forever change the course of his life and hers. Mrs. Holloway, a stout widow with a kind heart beneath her gruff exterior, took one look at Olivia and bustled into action, clucking like a mother hen as she helped the young woman into the warmth of the kitchen. "Land's sake, Thomas James, couldn't you have found her before she was drenched to the bone?" The older woman chided, though there was no real heat in her words. She was already putting on a kettle and pulling out dry clothes. "I came as soon as I saw her, Mrs. Holloway," Thomas replied, standing awkwardly by the door, water dripping from his duster onto the worn wooden floor. "Well, don't just stand there creating puddles. Fetch Dr. Morgan while I get this poor girl settled." Thomas nodded, grateful for the direction. "I'll be back as quick as I can," he promised, glancing once more at Olivia before heading back out into the storm. Olivia watched him go, uncertainty clouding her features. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. Mrs. Holloway snorted inelegantly. "Nonsense, child. No one in need is a burden in my house. Now, let's get you out of those wet things before you catch your death." As Mrs. Biba Holloway helped her change into a simple cotton nightgown and wrapped her in a thick quilt by the fire, Olivia felt the first stirrings of hope she'd experienced in months. The older woman asked no questions about her circumstances, merely tutted over her state and made sure she was comfortable. "The deputy," Olivia said hesitantly. "Is he trustworthy?" Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "Thomas James is one of the good ones, dear. Quiet man, keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a strong sense of right. Been here about 8 months now. Before that, I couldn't say, but he's proven himself in Sweetwater." Olivia nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. She placed a protective hand on her swollen belly as the baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing they might finally be safe. How far along are you? Mrs. Holloway asked, setting a cup of hot tea beside her. Nearly 8 months, I think, Olivia replied. I've lost track of time somewhat. The older woman nodded, asking nothing more, as Thomas returned with Dr. Morgan, a graying man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. Evening, miss, he greeted. Deputy James tells me you might need some looking after. Thomas hovered near the door, unsure if he should stay or go. After the doctor's brief examination, confirmed that both Olivia and the baby seemed healthy. Despite her exhaustion and malnourishment, Mrs. Holloway shooed both men toward the door. The girl needs rest, not an audience, she declared. Thomas, you can take the room across from mine tonight. I'll stay with Miss Jenkins. Thomas nodded, but before leaving, he turned to Olivia. If you need anything at all, I'll be close by. Olivia met his gaze, a mixture of gratitude and wariness in her eyes. Thank you, Deputy James. Thomas, he corrected gently. Just Thomas. As he left the room, Olivia felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest, quickly followed by fear. She had learned the hard way that kindness often came with hidden costs, and she couldn't afford to be wrong again, not with her child's future at stake. Morning broke clear and bright, washing away the previous night's storm. Thomas woke early, as was his habit, and found Mrs. Holloway already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. How is she? He asked, accepting the cup of coffee the landlady offered. Sleeping still, Mrs. Holloway replied. Poor thing was exhausted. Where do you reckon she came from? Thomas shook his head. Don't know. No coach arrived yesterday and she had no bags with her. Must have walked some distance. In her condition? Mrs. Holloway clicked her tongue disapprovingly. Whatever drove her here must have been dire indeed. Thomas silently agreed. He had seen that look in her eyes, the look of someone hunted, someone who had fled something worse than the uncertainty of being alone and pregnant in a strange town. I should get to the sheriff's office, Thomas said, finishing his coffee. Could you let Miss Jenkins know? I'll check in on her later. Mrs. Holloway nodded. I've got the back bedroom ready for her. She can stay there until things sort themselves out. Thomas tipped his hat gratefully. You're a good woman, Mrs. Holloway. Don't you sweet-talk me, Thomas James, she huffed, though her eyes twinkled. I'm just doing what any Christian soul would do. Thomas knew that wasn't entirely true. Sweetwater, like most frontier towns, had its share of charitable folks, but also those who'd turn away a woman in Olivia's situation, especially with no husband in sight and no clear story about where she'd come from. As he walked to the sheriff's office, Thomas found his thoughts continually drifting back to the woman at the church steps. There was something about her quiet dignity despite her circumstances that struck a chord in him. He recognized a fellow survivor when he saw one. Sheriff Daniels was already at his desk when Thomas arrived, reviewing wanted posters that had come in on yesterday's mail coach. Heard you found yourself a damsel in distress last night, the sheriff commented without looking up. News traveled fast in small towns. Miss Jenkins, Thomas corrected mildly. She was seeking shelter at the church. Mrs. Holloway's taken her in for now. Sheriff Daniels, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and shrewd eyes, finally looked up. Any idea where she's from or what brought her here? Thomas shook his head. Didn't seem right to press her, given her condition. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. Well, keep an eye on things. Last thing we need is trouble following her here. You think someone's after her? Pretty young woman, alone and expecting, showing up out of nowhere? Sheriff Daniels raised an eyebrow. There's always a story there, and not usually a happy one. Thomas couldn't disagree. He'd had the same thought himself. I'll keep watch, he promised. Meanwhile, at the boarding house, Olivia had finally awakened. For a moment, panic seized her as she found herself in an unfamiliar room. But then the events of the previous night came rushing back. The church steps, the rain, the deputy with the kind eyes who had promised she wasn't alone anymore. Mrs. Holloway entered with a tray of food, beaming when she saw Olivia was awake. There you are. I was beginning to think you'd sleep the day away, not that you didn't need it. Olivia pushed herself up against the pillows, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. What time is it? Just past 10, Mrs. Holloway replied, setting the tray across Olivia's lap. Deputy James has already been and gone, but he said he'd check on you later. Olivia nodded, feeling an unexpected flutter at the mention of the deputy. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the simple but nourishing meal before her: fresh bread, scrambled eggs, and a cup of milk. "Mrs. Holloway," she began hesitantly after a few bites, "I don't have much money, but I can work. I'm good with a needle, and I can cook and clean." The older woman waved a dismissive hand. "We'll worry about all that later. For now, you need to regain your strength and look after that baby." Olivia's eyes filled with tears at the woman's matter-of-fact kindness. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks between women," Mrs. Holloway said firmly. "Now eat up, and when you're ready, there's a bath waiting. Deputy James brought over some of Mrs. Peterson's old dresses. Her youngest just got married and left behind some clothes. They might need taking in, even with your condition, but they'll do for now." Once again, Olivia was struck by the unexpected generosity of these strangers. She had come to Sweetwater because it was far from where she'd started, a small enough town that she might blend in, but large enough to offer work for a single mother. She hadn't expected to find immediate kindness. After breakfast and the blissful luxury of a proper bath, Olivia felt more human than she had in weeks. Mrs. Holloway helped her dress in one of the borrowed gowns, a simple blue calico that, with some strategic pinning, accommodated her belly reasonably well. "There," Mrs. Holloway said with satisfaction. "Feeling better?" Olivia nodded, though anxiety still gnawed at her. "Mrs. Holloway, I should explain about my situation." The older woman held up a hand. "No need to tell me anything you don't want to, dear. The past is the past." "But I want you to understand," Olivia insisted. "You've been so kind, and I want to be honest with you." Mrs. Holloway's face softened as she sat beside Olivia on the bed. "Well then, if it will ease your mind." Olivia took a deep breath. "I was married," she began. "His name was Frederick Jenkins. He wasn't a kind man, though I didn't know that when we wed. When he discovered I was with child, things got worse. She faltered, one hand unconsciously moving to the faded bruise on her jaw. Mrs. Holloway's expression darkened. "Say no more on that score, child. I understand well enough." Olivia nodded gratefully. 3 months ago, there was a fire at our home in Kansas. Frederick had been drinking heavily. He didn't wake up when the flames spread." She closed her eyes, still able to smell the smoke, feel the heat as she had fled the burning house. "The town believed I died too. I let them think it. I took what little money we had and started heading west." Mrs. Holloway reached out and patted Olivia's hand. "So you're a widow?" "Yes," Olivia confirmed, "though I can't pretend I mourned him. Does that make me terrible?" "It makes you human," Mrs. Holloway said firmly, "and it seems to me you've been punished enough already." The sound of knocking interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Holloway rose to answer the door, returning moments later with Thomas, who hesitated at the threshold of Olivia's room. "Miss Jenkins," he greeted, hat in hand, "you're looking better today." Olivia offered a small smile, suddenly self-conscious. "Thanks to your kindness and Mrs. Holloway's care." An awkward silence fell between them, until Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat. "Well, I've got bread in the oven. You two have a talk while I see to it." With that, she bustled out, leaving them alone. Thomas remained by the door, clearly trying to give Olivia her space. "Sheriff Daniels asked me to check if there's anyone we should notify about your arrival in Sweetwater. Family, perhaps?" Olivia shook her head. "My parents passed some years ago. I have no family left." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "I understand. And your husband?" Olivia tensed slightly, but repeated the story she had just told Mrs. Holloway. Thomas listened intently, his expression revealing nothing until she mentioned the abuse. "I'm sorry you endured that," he said quietly, a flash of anger crossing his features before he controlled it. "No one should have to suffer such treatment, especially not from someone who vowed to cherish them." His sincere outrage on her behalf touched Olivia deeply. "It's in the past now," she said. "My concern is for the future for my child." Thomas took a step into the room, still maintaining a respectful distance. "Sweetwater is a good town, Miss Jenkins. People here look after their own. If you're planning to stay, you'll find help." "I'd like to stay," Olivia admitted, "at least until the baby comes. After that," she trailed off uncertain. "One day at a time," Thomas suggested gently. "For now, rest and regain your strength. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you're skilled with a needle? Olivia nodded. Yes, I worked as a seamstress before my marriage. Mrs. Turner at the general store was just saying yesterday that she's overwhelmed with mending. Once you're feeling up to it, I could speak to her on your behalf. Olivia's eyes widened with gratitude. You would do that? Thomas shifted, uncomfortable with her thanks. It's nothing, just being neighborly. It's everything to me, Olivia said softly. You've been more than neighborly, Deputy James. Thomas, he reminded her with a slight smile, and I've done nothing anyone else wouldn't do. But they both knew that wasn't true. In a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, especially to a woman in her circumstances, Thomas had offered kindness with no expectation of return. I should let you rest, Thomas said, retreating toward the door. But I'll check in again tomorrow, if that's all right? Olivia nodded. I'd like that, Thomas. As he left, Olivia found herself watching the door long after it closed behind him. There was something about Thomas James, a gentleness behind his reserved exterior, that made her feel safer than she had in years. It was dangerous to feel that way, she knew. She had trusted before and been betrayed. But something in her heart whispered that Thomas was different. Over the next few days, Olivia gradually regained her strength. True to his word, Thomas spoke with Mrs. Turner, who was delighted to have help with the backlog of mending. Although she wasn't well enough to work at the store yet, Mrs. Turner sent bundles of work to the boarding house, which Olivia completed sitting in the sunny parlor, or, on warmer days, in Mrs. Holloway's garden. Thomas stopped by daily, sometimes just for a few minutes to check on her, other times staying longer to share a cup of coffee or help her carry completed mending back to the store. Olivia found herself looking forward to these visits more than she wanted to admit. 1 week after her arrival, Thomas found Olivia in Mrs. Holloway's garden, carefully stitching a tier in a pair of work trousers. She looked up at his approach, a smile automatically brightening her face. "Good afternoon," she greeted. "You're earlier than usual?" Thomas nodded, taking a seat on the bench beside her. "Sheriff gave me the afternoon off, said I was hovering too much at the office with nothing to do." Olivia laughed, a sound that still surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed before coming to Sweetwater. "Well, I'm glad for the company. Mrs. Holloway has gone to her sister's for the day." Thomas looked momentarily concerned. "You shouldn't be alone in your condition." "I'm pregnant, not helpless," Olivia reminded him gently. "And I'm feeling much stronger now." Thomas had the grace to look abashed. "Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." They fell into a comfortable silence as Olivia continued her mending and Thomas watched the bees buzzing among Mrs. Holloway's flowers. Finally, he spoke again. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk, just down to the main street and back. The fresh air would do you good and—" He hesitated. "People are curious about you. It might ease things if they saw you weren't hiding away." Olivia's hands stilled on her work. She had known this moment would come, when she would have to face the scrutiny of the townspeople. She had hoped to delay it until after the baby came, but Thomas was right. Hiding away only fed speculation. "All right," she agreed, setting aside her sewing. "Just let me get my shawl." As they walked slowly toward the town's main street, Olivia was acutely aware of Thomas beside her. He had shortened his stride to match hers, and occasionally his hand hovered near her elbow when they crossed an uneven patch of ground, though he was careful not to touch her without invitation. "Tell me about yourself, Thomas," she said, partly to distract herself from the nerves fluttering in her stomach as they approached the busier part of town. "You know my story, but I know very little of yours." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Not much to tell. I grew up in Virginia, fought for the Union in the war, been drifting westward ever since." "No family?" Olivia asked gently. A shadow passed over his face. "Had a brother. Lost him at Gettysburg. Parents passed before the war." Olivia's heart ached for the loss she heard in his voice. "I'm sorry." Thomas shrugged. "It was a long time ago now." "But it still hurts," she observed quietly. He glanced at her, surprised by her perception. "Yes," he admitted. "It does." Before they could continue their conversation, they reached the main street, and Olivia felt the weight of curious stares. Thomas must have sensed her discomfort, because he moved slightly closer, his presence reassuring. "Deputy James," a woman called, approaching them with a warm smile. "And you must be Miss Jenkins," I'm Sarah Peterson. My dresses seem to be fitting you well enough." Olivia returned her smile gratefully. "Thank you for your generosity, Mrs. Peterson. I hope to return them in good condition once the baby arrives." "Keep them as long as you need, dear," the woman insisted. "And if you need anything else, you just let me know. We women have to look after each other out here." As they continued down the street, Olivia was introduced to several more townspeople. While she caught a few disapproving glances, most were welcoming, or at least politely curious. Thomas remained steadfastly by her side, his quiet presence lending her confidence. At the general store, Mrs. Turner was effusive in her praise of Olivia's needlework. "My dear, you have a real gift. When you're ready, I'd be happy to have you work in the store proper. There's a room in the back that could serve as a fitting area for the ladies." "That's very kind," Olivia said, genuinely touched. "Once the baby comes and I'm able, I'd be grateful for the opportunity." By the time they headed back to the boarding house, Olivia was tired but heartened by the overall reception. As they walked, Thomas offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Olivia took it. "Thank you," she said, "for encouraging me to do this. It wasn't as difficult as I feared." "Sweetwater folks are generally decent," Thomas replied. "They may gossip some, but they'll judge you by your actions, not your past." "I hope so," Olivia murmured, "for my child's sake as much as my own." Thomas glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Have you thought about names for the baby?" The question took Olivia by surprise. Frederick had never shown any interest in naming their child. In fact, he had rarely acknowledged her pregnancy except to complain about how it affected her ability to keep house to his standards. "If it's a girl, I thought perhaps Grace," she said slowly. "After my mother. And if it's a boy," she hesitated, "Samuel. It means heard by God. Because despite everything, I believe someone was listening when I prayed for a way out." Thomas nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "Good. Strong names, both of them." When they reached the boarding house, Thomas hesitated at the door. "Would you like me to stay until Mrs. Holloway returns? I don't like to think of you alone if anything were to happen." Olivia considered his offer. The proper thing would be to decline, to maintain the boundaries of propriety. But the genuine concern in his eyes touched her. "Perhaps, just for a while," she conceded. "We could have tea in the parlor." As they sat together in Mrs. Holloway's cozy parlor, sipping tea and talking of small, everyday things, Olivia felt a sense of peace that had been absent from her life for too long. There was something about Thomas's quiet strength that made her feel safe, yet never dominated or controlled as Frederick's presence had. "May I ask you something personal?" Olivia ventured after a comfortable lull in conversation. Thomas looked up, curious. "Of course. Why did you stop that night, at the church steps?" She had wondered this since their first meeting. Many men would have passed by and pretended not to see. Thomas considered her question carefully. "I suppose because I know what it is to be alone," he finally answered. "To feel like there's no one in the world who cares whether you live or die." He met her gaze steadily. No one should feel that way, especially not someone expecting a child. Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes. "You're a good man, Thomas James." He looked away, uncomfortable with her praise. "I try to be, don't always succeed." "None of us do," Olivia said softly. "But it's the trying that matters." As the days turned into weeks, Olivia became a familiar sight in Sweetwater. She spent mornings working on mending at the general store, and afternoons helping Mrs. Holloway with light chores around the boarding house, insisting on earning her keep despite the older woman's protests. Her belly grew larger, and Dr. Morgan assured her that the baby was healthy and strong. Thomas remained a constant presence in her life, checking on her daily and often accompanying her on short walks around town. Sometimes they talked of serious matters, his experiences in the war, her hopes for her child's future. Other times they simply enjoyed each other's company in comfortable silence. Olivia found herself watching for him, her heart lifting whenever he appeared. It was a feeling both wonderful and terrifying. She had sworn after Frederick that she would never again give her heart to a man, would never again make herself vulnerable in that way. Yet with Thomas, she felt not vulnerability, but strength, as if his presence amplified her own courage rather than diminishing it. For his part, Thomas discovered that for the first time since the war, he was no longer merely existing, but truly living. Seeing Sweetwater through Olivia's eyes made it feel less like another temporary stop, and more like somewhere he might belong. He found himself making plans that extended beyond the next week or month, thoughts of permanence that both excited and frightened him. One evening in late September, nearly a month after Olivia's arrival, Thomas escorted her back to the boarding house after supper at the hotel restaurant, a small luxury he had insisted upon when he received his monthly pay. The night was clear, the stars brilliant above the small town, and a pleasant chill in the air hinted at the approaching autumn. They walked slowly, Olivia's hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm. At the boarding house steps, she paused. "Would you like to sit for a while?" she asked, gesturing to the small bench on the porch. "It's such a beautiful night." Thomas nodded, helping her settle onto the bench before sitting beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. For a time, they simply gazed at the star-filled sky, content in each other's company. "I never thanked you properly," Olivia said suddenly, breaking the silence. Thomas turned to her, puzzled. "For what?" "For finding me that night, for saying those words." She met his gaze in the soft lamplight spilling from the window. "You're not alone anymore. You have no idea what they meant to me." Thomas swallowed, moved by the emotion in her voice. "I meant them," he said simply. "And I still do." Olivia's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "I know," she whispered. "That's what frightens me sometimes." "What does?" Thomas asked, his heart hammering at her touch. "How much I've come to depend on you. How much I've come to—" She faltered, then gathered her courage. "How much I've come to care for you." Thomas stared at her, scarcely daring to believe what he was hearing. "Olivia, But whatever he might have said was cut short as Olivia suddenly gasped, her hand tightening painfully around his. "What is it?" he asked, alarmed. Olivia looked down at her skirts, where a spreading dampness was visible even in the dim light. "I think my waters have broken," she said, a mixture of fear and wonder in her voice. "The baby is coming." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Thomas ran for Dr. Morgan, while Mrs. Holloway helped Olivia to her room and prepared for the birth. By the time Thomas returned with the doctor, Olivia's labor pains had begun in earnest. "You men wait downstairs," Mrs. Holloway ordered, ushering Thomas and the doctor into the bedroom. "This is women's work now." But Dr. Morgan shook his head. "I need to examine her, Mrs. Holloway. Thomas, you can wait outside." Thomas nodded, his face pale with worry. Before he left, he approached Olivia's bedside, taking her hand briefly. "You're strong," he told her firmly. "Stronger than anyone I know. You can do this." Olivia managed a smile despite her pain. "I'm not alone," she reminded him, echoing his words from their first meeting. The labor was long and difficult. Thomas paced the downstairs parlor, flinching at every cry that echoed down the staircase. Sheriff Daniels stopped by briefly, clapping him on the shoulder. "First babies often take their time," he said, trying to reassure the younger man. "My Sarah was in labor for nearly 20 hours with our first." But this did little to ease Thomas's anxiety. As the night wore on, the cries from upstairs grew more frequent and more distressing. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Thomas slipped upstairs, hovering in the hallway outside Olivia's room. Dr. Morgan emerged briefly, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his forehead beaded with sweat. He looked surprised to see Thomas, but not displeased. "How is she?" Thomas asked urgently. "Struggling," the doctor admitted. "The baby is large and she's exhausted, but she's fighting hard." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. Is there anything I can do?" Dr. Morgan considered him for a moment, then nodded. "Come in. Sometimes having someone to hold on to can help a woman find that last bit of strength." Thomas followed the doctor into the room, his heart in his throat. Olivia lay on the bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her face contorted in pain. Mrs. Holloway sat beside her, wiping her brow with a damp cloth and murmuring encouragement. When Olivia saw Thomas, her eyes widened in surprise, then relief. He moved to her side, taking her hand in his. "I'm here," he said simply. Olivia squeezed his hand with surprising strength as another contraction tore through her. "Don't leave," She gasped when it had passed. Never, Thomas promised, and in that moment, he knew it was true. Whatever happened tonight, whatever the future held, he would never willingly leave her side again. The next hours were the most harrowing Thomas had ever experienced, including his time on the battlefield. Olivia fought with every ounce of her being, drawing on reserves of strength that amazed everyone in the room. Thomas remained steadfast, letting her crush his hand during contractions, wiping her brow during the brief respites, and whispering words of encouragement that he hoped gave her strength. Finally, as dawn was breaking over Sweetwater, Dr. Morgan announced, "I can see the head! One more good push, Olivia." With a cry that seemed to come from her very soul, Olivia gave one final, mighty push. A moment later, the room filled with the indignant wail of a newborn. "A boy!" Dr. Morgan announced, lifting the squalling infant for Olivia to see. "A fine, healthy son." Tears streamed down Olivia's face as Mrs. Holloway quickly cleaned and swaddled the baby before placing him in his mother's arms. "Samuel," Olivia whispered, gazing down at the red, wrinkled face. "My Samuel." Thomas stood transfixed, overwhelmed by what he had just witnessed. The creation of a new life, born of such suffering yet bringing such joy. When Olivia looked up at him, her face radiant despite her exhaustion, he felt something break and remake itself within his chest. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked softly. Thomas hesitated, suddenly terrified. "I've never held a baby before." "There's nothing to it," Mrs. Holloway assured him, already lifting the bundled infant from Olivia's arms. "Just support his head and don't drop him." With trembling hands, Thomas accepted the tiny burden. Samuel had quieted now, his eyes the same cornflower blue as his mother's, blinking up at this new face. A tiny hand escaped the blanket, and Thomas found his finger caught in a surprisingly strong grip. "Hello, Samuel," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the world." Looking up, he found Olivia watching them, an expression on her face that stole his breath away. In that moment, Thomas James knew with absolute certainty that he had found his home and his family. The weeks following Samuel's birth were a time of adjustment for everyone. Olivia recovered her strength gradually, with Mrs. Holloway and several other women from town taking turns helping with the baby and household chores. Thomas visited daily, often bringing small gifts, a rattle he had carved himself, a soft blanket purchased from the general store, wildflowers gathered on his morning patrol. 1 month after Samuel's arrival, on a crisp October afternoon, Thomas found Olivia sitting in Mrs. Holloway's garden, the baby sleeping peacefully in a basket beside her. She smiled at his approach, a warmth in her eyes that gave him courage. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, taking a seat beside her. "A dangerous pastime," Olivia teased gently. Thomas smiled, then sobered. "Olivia, I'm not a man of many words or grand gestures. I've spent most of my life wandering, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots." He looked down at Samuel, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. "But since meeting you, both of you, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Olivia's breath caught as Thomas took her hand in his. "What I'm trying to say, poorly, is that I love you, Olivia Jenkins. I love your strength, your kindness, your courage. I love this little boy as if he were my own. And if you'll have me, I'd like to make us a family, proper and legal." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. "Thomas, are you asking what I think you're asking?" He nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band, nothing fancy, but solid and true, like the man offering it. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "and I know it might seem too soon. We've known each other only a short while, and you've been through so much. If you need time..." Olivia silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. "Thomas James, do you know what I thought that first night when you found me on those church steps?" He shook his head, his heart hammering in his chest. "I thought that if there were more men like you in this world, women like me wouldn't need to run in the first place." She cupped his cheek gently. "I love you too, and yes, I will marry you." Thomas's face broke into a smile of such joy that Olivia's heart nearly burst with the wonder of it. Slowly, reverently, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but neither of them cared. "When?" he asked simply. Olivia considered. "Soon," she decided. "Before winter sets in. A small ceremony with just our friends here in Sweetwater." Thomas nodded, already thinking of the small house at the edge of town that had recently become available. It needed work, but with effort, it could be a real home, their home. Samuel chose that moment to wake, his small face scrunching up as he prepared to announce his hunger to the world. Olivia laughed, lifting him from his basket and cradling him against her shoulder. "I think he approves," she said, as the baby quieted at her touch. Thomas leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "I'll be a good father to him, Olivia. I swear it." "I know you will," she whispered. "You already are." 2 weeks later, on a bright Sunday morning after services, Olivia Jenkins became Olivia James in a simple ceremony at the very church where Thomas had found her. Mrs. Holloway cried unabashedly, and even Sheriff Daniels was seen to discreetly wipe his eye as the couple exchanged their vows. Samuel, dressed in a christening gown made from one of Mrs. Peterson's donated dresses that Olivia had skillfully repurposed, slept through the entire ceremony in Dr. Morgan's wife's arms. Afterward, the whole town gathered for a celebration at the hotel restaurant, bringing gifts and well wishes for the new family. That evening, Thomas carried Olivia over the threshold of their new home, the small house he had been working on every spare moment since her acceptance of his proposal. It wasn't grand, but it was solid and clean, with new curtains at the windows and a cradle he had crafted himself for Samuel. "What do you think?" he asked anxiously as she looked around the simple front room with its stone fireplace and comfortable, if mismatched, furniture. Olivia turned to him, her eyes shining. "It's perfect. It's home." As they settled Samuel in his cradle and prepared for their first night as husband and wife, Olivia found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From fear and desperation on those church steps to this moment of profound happiness, it seemed almost miraculous. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Thomas's arms around her, she voiced this thought. "Do you believe in fate, Thomas?" she asked softly. "That some things are meant to be?" He was silent for a moment, considering. "I don't know about fate," he finally answered, "but I do believe that sometimes, when we're at our lowest point, life gives us exactly what we need, if we're brave enough to accept it." Olivia thought of that rainy night, of the courage it had taken to flee her old life with nothing but hope for her unborn child, of the man who had stopped when others might have passed by. "I'm glad you stopped," she whispered. "I'm glad you said those words." Thomas pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You're not alone anymore," he quoted softly, "and you never will be again." As the years passed, the James family became fixtures in Sweetwater. Thomas eventually became sheriff when Daniels retired, his quiet strength and unwavering sense of justice making him respected throughout the county. Olivia's skill with a needle led to a thriving business at the general store, where she created beautiful dresses and suits for townsfolk and visitors alike. Samuel grew into a strong, kind-hearted boy, with his mother's blue eyes and a quiet dignity that reminded everyone of his adoptive father. He never knew the truth of his parentage until he was old enough to understand. And when Olivia finally told him the full story, his response was simple. "Pa is the one who chose us, who loved us when he didn't have to. That makes him more my father than anyone could be by blood." 2 years after their wedding, Olivia gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth Grace. She was followed 2 years later by another son, Michael Thomas. Their family was complete, their happiness profound though not without challenges. Life on the frontier was never easy, but they faced every hardship together, drawing strength from the love that had brought them together on those church steps. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas surprised Olivia with a small silver locket. Inside was a tiny sketch of the church where they had met, masterfully rendered by a traveling artist who had passed through town. "To remember where our story began," he said as he fastened it around her neck. Olivia touched the locket gently, then reached up to caress the face of the man who had become her, everything, her protector, her partner, her lover, her friend. "Our story began the moment you said those words," she corrected softly. "You're not alone anymore. Everything since has just been the chapters of a life I never dared dream of." Thomas pulled her close, marveling as he often did at the twists of fate that had brought them together. He had been a drifter, a man haunted by the past and afraid to hope for a future. She had been a desperate woman, fleeing violence and praying for sanctuary. They had found each other on the steps of a church in a rainstorm, and in doing so, they had each found the missing piece of themselves. Where once there had been loneliness, now there was family. Where once there had been fear, now there was safety. Where once there had been uncertainty, now there was the steady bedrock of a love that had been tested by time and found unshakable. "I love you, Olivia James," Thomas whispered against her hair. "And I love you." "Thomas James," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as the setting sun bathed their home in golden light. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days that follow." Outside, their children's laughter rang clear in the evening air, the sound of joy, of family, of a future built on the foundation of two simple words spoken on a stormy night, words that had changed everything. "You're not alone anymore," and they never were again.